Hello. So today I wanted to talk about Proverbs 16 um, because I think in this chapter we see the what we might call the apparent contradictions, the apparent conflict between man's free will and God's sovereignty. We see that joined pretty harmoniously in this chapter. Um, And I think I want to start off by saying I think Tim Keller addresses this apparent problem pretty well when he says that the distinctions between man's free will and God's sovereignty appear in what he calls a seemingly paradoxical. And I think that's a really good way to put it because it's as if these things seem incompatible within our own mind, and yet they exist again harmoniously. So this chapter I think gets into that pretty distinctly, and so I wanted to talk about. So in verse 1 it says, "The plans and reflections of the heart belong to man, but the wise answer uh, of the tongue is from the Lord." So I think in that first verse there's man planning his ways. There's man reflecting on what he wills to do, but then also you have in the moment of speech, in that sort of fraction of an instant, you have God giving him the answer, or giving him the words of his mouth. So I think you see that also with throughout the text. Say when Jesus says, like, don't prepare what you will say, but rather the Holy Spirit will be with you, and yeah, we'll essentially like give you the words to speak. So on that point, I think that a lot of the text, a lot of the Bible, when pulled out of context, can not make sense or can seem to contradict itself. And so I think what we have to look for when we look at these with these like apparent contradictions, we have to look for ways that they are tied together, because I think instinctually they are, even if in ways that appear to us incompatible. And so I think this notion of free will and God's sovereignty is a good way to address this dualism. That I think when you read the Bible and study it, you see these things that have sort of a dualistic meaning or dualistic purpose. Um, so already we see, man's free will, the plans and reflections of the heart belong to man, but the wise answers of the tongue of the Lord. Right. So we have the things that man wants to do, but in the exact moment, it's as if God is intervening, and sort of giving man the words to say. So I think you have in that first verse laid out already. In man's planning his ways, you have his free will, but God, in giving the words, that would be illustrative of his sovereignty. And so in verse 2, all the ways of man are clean and innocent in his own eyes, and he may see nothing wrong with his actions. The Lord weighs and examines the motives and intents of the heart and knows the truth. So I think this is sort of a continuation of verse 1, where you have in verse 1, the plans and reflections of the heart belong to man. And so in a way, the things that he wills to do, he might think them beneficial, he might think them maybe even right, morally correct. But there is an ultimate answering to God that will happen at some point in his life. And I think you see that again throughout the Bible, especially with in context, especially with Proverbs. You see so sort of the first proverb is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? It's as if this is the point that is the starting point, and from there, that is where wisdom is growing. So it's not like this is this is one thing that you must have to have wisdom, and then you can kind of leave it aside as you pursue and grow in wisdom. But it's as if more this is the starting point, and it's something that you keep with you continuously. So more along the lines of being a foundation, or a basic principle of wisdom. So I think, again, in context, there is like the notion that this man, when he is planning his ways, when he is reflecting on what he would like to do, when he's reflecting on his will, what he wills to do, I think there is a notion of that Proverbs 1, right, where he's already understand that if I will to act correctly, then I have to operate within the fear of the Lord. Um, so I would say those two things are distinct, right? You have the fear of the Lord, and you also have sort of God's intervention or God's sovereignty. So I don't think, fearing the Lord is saying that essentially that God is going to be like overpowering my life, and I no longer have the will to do anything. Because we'll see later on that even the wicked man can correct his ways, and so there's laid out for the righteous and the wicked, essentially the ways to bring their lives into more adherence with that first principle, that fear of the Lord. So I think verse 3 is where really we start to see the distinctions between man's free will, and then especially in verse 9 we'll see that echoed with God's sovereignty. So in verse 3 we have, commit your works to the Lord, submit and trust them to him, and your plans will succeed if you respond to his will and guidance. So that one I think is pretty interesting, because this sort of sets the stage here. So here you have man choosing to do what he wills, and yet you have man's, in this verse, you have man's free will, essentially. Commit your works to the Lord, right? So it's saying, like, in the things that you're willing to do, in the things that you're choosing to do, the things that you have the autonomy to make choices about, if you submit them and trust them to him, again, I don't think that's necessarily saying, like, I'm going to just live a hands-off life and God's going to do everything for me. It's saying instead, rather, that in the things that I will to do, the things that I desire to do, I will live under that first principle of the fear of the Lord, right? And so with that first principle, there is the sort of the outreaching of that in verse 3, where you're saying, like, in the things that you're choosing to do, if you commit them to the Lord, your plans will succeed. And so in this verse you have I think a pretty clear-cut benediction from God to say, like, you should do things, right? You should be active. You should be an active agent in your own life. Again, though, it sort of operates on that presupposition, though, of are you operating in according to God's tenets? And so I don't think those are things that can be apart from each other, right? Like you couldn't say that if you commit your works, or that your plans will succeed if you don't commit your works to the Lord, right? I don't think that would be a correct conclusion to draw on that. I think the plan succeeding sort of hinges on them being committed to the Lord for the righteous man. And then I think the second part there of verse 3, your plans will succeed if you respond to his will and guidance. And so again, like you have man choosing to do something. I'm stepping out and I'm moving forward in one direction, and then I have, like, this is something that I'm willing to do. I'm choosing to do this of my own agency, but then I also have God directing me, God guiding me. I think you see this especially with Paul and the nature of the Holy Spirit on how he directed his missionary journeys. Again, these are things that he willed to do, and he again operated underneath that fear of the Lord. So move on to verse 4, and this I think is where it gets interesting. The the Lord has made everything for its own purpose, even the wicked according to their role for the day of evil. So this one, I think it introduces a new idea. The first part where it says the Lord has made everything for its own purpose, that I think highlights the idea of God's sovereignty, the idea of God's omniscience, especially in reflection to verse 3, where it's this constant sort of back and forth thing that we see in this chapter. And this is why I find it so interesting, where you have man's free will and then you have God's sovereignty illuminated. So the Lord has made everything for its own purpose, right? So you have God over everything. And then you say, even the wicked according to their role for the day of evil. So this this idea, I think, we can really get into it, and perhaps that'll be a different video. But it touches on God uses the wicked to serve their own purpose in God's overarching plan for eternity. So I think without getting really that deep into it at this point, I think just to say this doesn't make God the author of evil. I think really what it shows here is that in a fallen world, the wicked have a purpose. They have a purpose that is beneath God's sovereignty, pointing to the duality between God's sovereignty and man's free will. Right? You have, previous in this chapter so far, we've been looking at, to the most extent, we've been looking at the righteous man looking to plan his ways, to consider his heart, and with the addition of God in those plans and in those considerations. But I think also what you have here is that you have those who are acting in opposition to God, who are acting not under that basic tenet or that first principle of the fear of the Lord. And so even still, you have, again, this duality between the wicked that would obviously be an antithesis to God, but then again, you have God over all things. You have God completely sovereign over all things, and using this this wickedness for perhaps the greater good, or just as the verse says, for its own purpose. And I think, especially when you look at Romans, right? God uses all things for the good of those who love Him. So I think again you see this wickedness, but then you see it become good, or I think this idea of redemption is pretty common to see in the Bible. But then again, you see some that are not redeemed, right? But it's not to say that they're operating outside of God's sovereignty. I would say no, and I think this is a good illustration of how we can have man completely free and God completely sovereign. Then these two things, again, as Tim Keller I think so rightly puts, that it's seemingly paradoxical, because we think that these two things cannot exist together. But I think here you have the wicked choosing to reject God and living in that rejection, right? Living out what that entails. But then you have God here saying that this is according to my own purpose, right? So it would be a wrong conclusion to say that God then is directing evil, right? Because that wouldn't make sense, right? That would be in opposition to God's nature. But what you can say is that you have free will now, operating of its own volition, and then you have God ordering all these things, right, for His own purpose. So I think, again, this is why this chapter I find just fascinating, because it has these topics that again seem so distinct, and yet they have a unity to them. Verse 7 and 8 again kind of continues in also 5 and 6. Everyone who is proud and arrogant in heart is disgusting and exceedingly offensive to the Lord. Be assured He will not go unpunished. Verse 6. By mercy and loving kindness and truth, not superficial ritual, wickedness is cleansed from the heart. By fear of the Lord one avoids evil. extremely interesting here. So first, verse 5, you have in the continuation of verse 4, you've been wicked for the day of judgment. So you have sort of the nature of the wicked played out here in verse 5. And you have sort of how God views their wickedness, right? Not the individual, but their wickedness. But then again, verse 6, I think this is so interesting. By mercy and loving kindness and truth, not superficial ritual, wickedness is cleansed from the heart, and by fear of the Lord one avoids evil. So you have the ability then, right, to you have the ability to essentially change your ways, right? God is giving giving the tenets, right? Giving the principle of saying, like, if you're walking in this path of wickedness and you're living out this path of wickedness that is in rebellion to that first tenet, that basic principle, you have ways where you can correct yourself, right? And so I think this is so interesting because you have, again, like this dual nature of like man's first recognition that this is not what I should be doing, and then secondly you have by God, like, do these things and you will correct your ways. So it would be, I find it so inseparable to say that this is 100% man's will or 100% God's sovereignty, where I think it's a bit of both, right? Where you have man has to first recognize that he needs God. And so, but then God lays out the principles to, like, this is how you would change your life and serve me. This is what I'm asking of you, right? He's not saying, again, the not superficial ritual, right? So by mercy and loving kindness and truth, so by adhering to mercy, loving kindness and truth, wickedness is cleansed from the heart, right? So it's like coming to God and adopting that first principle, the fear of the Lord, right, is the beginning of wisdom, and saying that, like, I'm going to now sort of adhere to your ways, right? Or as verse 3 says, right? If we commit your works to the Lord, submit and trust them to Him. So you have, like, man wicked, recognizing his wickedness and then changing, right? And that I think, again, it is, like, so difficult to separate those two things. And I think people who are more advocating for God's complete sovereignty, they say that, like, there's the idea of what is it? Just like absolute degradation, where, like, man cannot redeem himself, and so it's entirely on God then to redeem man. But I think address that with God essentially calls to all men, right? He says that he would will that no men suffer, and then no men die apart from him. And you have other verses where it's like Jesus came to save all people. And so I think, again, it would be so difficult to say that, like, well, God is essentially, like, choosing who's gonna save, who he's not gonna save by divine providence. But then how do you couple that with those verses? To me, it seems so distinct. And so I think it points at this, again, to reiterate what Tim Keller said, this seeming paradox that it actually exists in a perfect harmony. So you have verse 7 and 8. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies be at peace with him. Better is a little righteousness than great income gained with injustice. So I think verse 7 and 8 are the sort of the flip side of verse 5 and 6, where you have, instead of the wicked man correcting his ways, you have here the righteous man walking in the tenets, in the principles of God. But there's an agency here. There's a level of choice here that man has to do, and the man has to choose to do, has to will to do. And I think, verse 7 lays out, like, what comes of that, kind of in echo of verse 5. And so here's the last verse we'll touch on, verse 9. A man's mind plans his ways as he journeys through life, but the Lord directs his steps and establishes them. So this and verse 3 are really the big ones. So verse 3, commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will succeed. Verse 9, a man's mind plans his ways, but the Lord directs his steps. So verse 3, commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will succeed, right? So all that's saying is in the things you choose to do, commit them to God, and you will be successful, right? They will succeed, or they will come to fruition. And so in this, you see like the things that are unique to me, the things that make me who I am, the things that I desire to do, the things that I would will to have happen in my life. If I can commit them to God, right? He's saying here they will succeed, or that they will make themselves manifest, that they will come to fruition. But then in verse 9, I think this is where it gets extremely interesting. A man's mind plans his ways. So again, kind of like in verse 3 where it says, commit your works to the Lord, like in the things you're choosing to do, in the planning of your ways, you have the Lord in verse 9 directs his steps and establishes them. Right, so you have, in verse 9 it is very similar, I think, to verse 1, where you have in verse 9, the Lord directs his steps and establishes them. In verse 1, the wise answer of the tongue is from the Lord. You have these things where it seems like in those, both in verse 1, that split second where the mouth is open and words come forth, and you have in verse 9 where kind of in a more of an overarching way, but still in a very intimate and connected way, you have God sort of overseeing the plans of both, as we have in verse 9, the righteous, and then in verse 5 and 6, the wicked. So it's, again, I think verse 3 and verse 9 are really the ones that exhibit this duality. Commit your works to the Lord, your plans will succeed. So it's in the things you choose to do. If you commit them to God, right? If you're walking and you're already operating under that first tenet, that basic principle, if you're already operating under that, then the things that you choose to do, right? If you're like doing things with God in vision, then the things you choose to do will succeed. But then again, you have in verse 9, like in the planning of your ways, in the things that you're choosing to do, you have the Lord directing your steps and establishing them. So it's such a comfort, I think, when you have this like ability to be in God. You have the ability to choose to do things, the ability to will, but you also have God sort of walking with you in all ways and protecting you and guiding you, right? And so I think there's a level of responsiveness that we as Christians have to have to God's guidance. But also I think we have to be willing to do things, right? We have to be active in our faith. I think that was pretty much it. I found this was a very interesting chapter. Let me know what you guys think, and thanks for watching.